A woman stands alone in the freezing town square, her swollen belly exposed to cruel stares and vicious whispers. No money, no shelter, no mercy. The crowd closes in, their judgment sharper than the winter wind cutting through her threadbare coat. She's about to collapse when a scarred stranger steps from the shadows, a man the town fears more than they pity her. His offer isn't charity, it's a gamble, and she's out of options. What happens next will shatter everything this frontier town believes about survival, redemption, and what it means to choose your own family. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of Miller's General Store, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over Josephine Carter's already filthy traveling dress. She stepped down carefully, one hand pressed against her lower back, the other gripping the coach rail for balance. 7 months pregnant and every bone in her body screaming from 3 days of rough road. Red Hollow looked exactly like the kind of place people ran away from, not toward. The main street stretched out in both directions, wooden storefronts leaning slightly to one side, their paint peeling from years of harsh sun and harsher winters. A saloon at the north end, its doors swinging open to release a burst of tobacco smoke and off-key piano music. At the south end, a church with a steeple that seemed to judge everything below it. And in between, maybe 24 buildings that all looked like they'd been built by men who'd given up halfway through. Josephine pulled her shawl tighter and tried to ignore the stares, because everyone was staring. A woman in a green dress whispered something to her companion, and they both turned away with their noses in the air. 2 men loading supplies onto a wagon stopped mid-lift to gawk. A child pointed, and his mother slapped his hand down while shooting Josephine a look that could have curdled milk. She'd expected this, prepared for it even. But knowing something's coming and actually standing in the middle of it are 2 very different things. "Ma'am," the stagecoach driver handed down her single battered trunk. You got people here?" "I will," Josephine said, forcing confidence into her voice that she absolutely did not feel. The driver didn't look convinced. He glanced at her belly, then at the hostile crowd gathering like vultures, then back at her face. "You sure about that?" "Positive." It was a lie, but it was the only currency she had left. The driver tipped his hat, climbed back onto the coach, and within minutes was disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust. Josephine watched him go, fighting the urge to run after him, screaming, "Wait, take me back, anywhere but here." But there was no back anymore. There was only forward. She picked up her trunk, heavier than it should have been for how little she owned, and started walking toward the boarding house across the street. The sign read, "Mrs. Halloway's Rooms for Rent," in faded letters that might have once been cheerful. The crowd parted as she walked, not out of courtesy but out of something closer to disgust. She caught fragments of whispers. "No wedding ring?" The audacity. "Probably came here thinking we're desperate enough." Josephine kept her eyes forward and her chin up. She'd survived worse than gossip. The boarding house door stood open, and she could see a woman inside arranging flowers on a small table, 50-ish, gray hair pulled into a severe bun, the kind of face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile sometime around 1850. "Mrs. Halloway?" Josephine stepped inside, grateful to be out of the sun and away from the stairs. The woman turned, took one look at Josephine's condition, and her expression went from neutral to ice cold in half a second. "We're full." "I haven't even asked." "I said we're full." Mrs. Halloway turned back to her flowers, arranging them with sharp, angry movements. "And we will remain full, indefinitely." Josephine set down her trunk, her back protesting the movement. "I can pay. I have money." "I don't care if you have the crown jewels in that trunk. I run a respectable establishment." "I'm not asking for charity, just a room." Mrs. Halloway spun around, her face flushed with righteous anger. "You think I don't know what you are? Coming here with your belly out to here, no husband, no family, thinking some desperate rancher or miner will take pity on you and give you a name?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a venomous whisper. "We don't need your kind bringing shame to this town." "My kind?" Josephine's own anger flared hot and bright. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough. I know that ring finger's bare as the day you were born. I know you're carrying a bastard child and looking to make it someone else's problem." The word hit like a slap. Josephine wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she had been married, that her husband had been a monster who'd beaten her until she'd lost count of the bruises, who told her he'd kill her the next time she disrespected him, that she'd fled in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on her back and the small stash of money she'd been hiding for 2 years. But she didn't owe this woman her story. "I need a place to stay," Josephine said quietly. "Just until I find work." "You won't find work here. Not in your condition, not with your reputation." "I don't have a reputation. You don't even know my name." Mrs. Halloway's smile was cruel, "And I intend to keep it that way. Now get out of my establishment before I have my son remove you." Josephine stood there for a long moment, trying to think of something, anything, to say that would change this woman's mind. But the hatred in Mrs. Halloway's eyes was absolute, religious, unshakable. She picked up her trunk and walked back out into the sun. The crowd had grown larger. Word traveled fast in small towns. An apparently pregnant stranger gets rejected by the boarding house was the most exciting thing to happen in Red Hollow all month. Josephine walked to the next building, a smaller, shabbier establishment with a hand-painted sign that read, "Rooms." The proprietor, a thin man with tobacco-stained teeth, took one look at her and shook his head. "Can't help you." "You haven't heard my offer." "Don't need to. Mrs. Halloway already sent word you're not welcome." Josephine's hands clenched into fists. "She doesn't own every building in town." "She might as well. Her husband's the mayor, her brother runs the bank, and her son's the sheriff." The man actually looked apologetic. "I got a business to run. Can't afford to cross the Halloways." The next 3 places said the same thing in different words. By the time Josephine reached the last possible option, a dilapidated building at the edge of town that looked like it might collapse if someone sneezed nearby, she was fighting to keep her composure. The owner was a woman older than Mrs. Halloway, with kind eyes that looked genuinely sorry when she shook her head. "I would if I could, honey, but I got grandkids who depend on me. If the Halloways blackball my business..." She reached out like she might touch Josephine's arm, then thought better of it. "You should leave town. Ain't nothing here for you but trouble." Josephine walked back to the center of town, her trunk growing heavier with each step. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, and the November air was getting colder. She could see storm clouds gathering to the west. She set her trunk down in front of the general store and sat on it, trying to think. She had $17, enough for maybe a week's food if she was careful. Not enough for a stagecoach ticket to anywhere that mattered. Not enough to rent a room even if someone would take her money. Not enough for anything except a slow death by exposure. The crowd hadn't dispersed. If anything, more people had gathered, watching her like she was a circus act. A few women whispered behind their fans. Some men leered. A group of teenage boys laughed and pointed. "Reckon she'll be offering services by nightfall," one of them said loudly enough for everyone to hear. His friends erupted in laughter. Josephine's face burned, but she didn't respond. Responding would only make it worse. A well-dressed man approached, middle-aged, prosperous-looking, with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. He stopped a few feet away and looked her up and down like he was evaluating livestock. "You looking for work?" he asked. Josephine's pulse quickened. "Yes. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. That's not the kind of work I'm offering." His smile was oily. "But if you're desperate enough, I might have a position for you. I own the saloon. We're always looking for girls who know how to entertain." The crowd went silent, waiting to see what she'd say. Josephine stood up slowly, her hands shaking with rage and humiliation. "I'd rather freeze to death." The man shrugged. "Suit yourself, but that's about your only other option." He walked away, chuckling. The whispers started up again, louder now. "Did you hear what he offered her? Shameless. That's what happens when women have no morals. Someone should run her out of town before she corrupts our daughters." Josephine sank back down onto her trunk, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. Not here. Not in front of these people. The sky was darkening fast. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees in the last hour. She could see her breath now, small white clouds that disappeared almost instantly. She had no plan, no backup, no clever scheme waiting in her back pocket. For the first time since leaving her husband, Josephine allowed herself to consider the possibility that this was it, that she'd made a catastrophic mistake, that she and her baby would die here, in this miserable town, surrounded by strangers who would probably feel vindicated when they found her frozen body in the morning. At least I tried, she thought. At least I didn't just give up and let him kill me. It wasn't much of a consolation, but it was something. She was so lost in her own thoughts that she didn't notice the man approaching until he was standing right in front of her. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of build that comes from years of hard physical labor. He wore work clothes that had seen better days, canvas pants, a worn shirt, a leather vest that was more patches than original material. His face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see enough to note the scar running from his left temple down to his jaw. Not a clean scar from a surgeon's knife, but a jagged, angry line that looked like it had been made by something sharp and cruel. The crowd's whispers changed tone. Now they weren't just gossiping, they were uneasy. The man looked down at Josephine for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You need a place to stay," he said. It wasn't a question. Josephine's throat was dry. "Yes. I got a ranch about 10 miles north, Stone Ridge. I need someone to cook and keep house, room and board included. $40 a month." It took Josephine a moment to process what he was saying. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a deal. You work, you get paid and a place to sleep. You don't work, you leave. Simple as that." Someone in the crowd gasped. "Elias, you can't be serious," a woman's voice called out. "Look at her condition." The man, Elias, didn't turn around. "I can see just fine, Martha. She's about to give birth any day now. Then she'll need a place to do it." His voice was flat, emotionless. "Either way, not your concern." A man stepped forward, older, wearing a silver star on his chest. The sheriff. "Vance, think about what you're doing. You don't know this woman, don't know where she came from or what she's running from." Now Elias did turn, and even Josephine could see the crowd take a collective step back. "I don't recall asking for your input, Holloway." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "I'm just saying, a man in your position should be more careful about who he brings onto his property. People will talk." "People are already talking." Elias turned back to Josephine. "Decision's yours. You can stay here and freeze, or you can take the job. I'm heading out in 5 minutes, either way." Josephine looked at the crowd, then at the sheriff, then at Mrs. Holloway, who had emerged from her boarding house to watch the spectacle. Every instinct she had was screaming that this was a bad idea, that climbing into a wagon with a strange man and riding 10 miles into the wilderness was insane, that she knew nothing about this Elias Vance, except that the entire town seemed terrified of him. But her other options were freeze to death in the street, sell herself to the saloon owner, or nothing. There was no third option. "I'll take the job," she said, standing up. The crowd erupted in whispers. Elias picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing and started walking toward a wagon parked at the edge of town. Josephine followed, keeping her eyes straight ahead, refusing to look at the judgmental faces on either side. Mrs. Holloway's voice cut through the noise. "You're making a mistake, girl. That man's dangerous." Josephine didn't respond. She just kept walking. The wagon was simple but sturdy. A flatbed with wooden sides pulled by 2 massive draft horses that looked like they could pull a house if they had to. Elias loaded her trunk in the back, then offered his hand to help her up onto the seat. His hand was rough with calluses and strong enough that he practically lifted her up himself. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue at the horses. They started forward without hesitation, their hooves clopping against the packed dirt of the main street. The crowd parted, still whispering. As they left Red Hollow behind, Josephine glanced back once. She could see the townspeople standing in clusters, watching them go. She could practically feel their disapproval radiating across the distance. Good riddance. They rode in silence for maybe 20 minutes, the town disappearing behind them as the landscape opened up into rolling hills covered in dry grass. The sun had set completely now, and the first stars were appearing in a sky that seemed impossibly vast after months of being trapped in cities and towns. Finally, Josephine spoke. "Why did you do that?" Elias didn't look at her. "Need a cook, you need a job. Makes sense."
That's not what I mean. Why did you offer me the job? You could have hired anyone.
Anyone I hire is going to demand twice what I'm willing to pay and quit after a month when they realize how hard the work is. You're desperate. Desperate people don't quit easily. His bluntness was almost refreshing after the saccharine cruelty of the townspeople. So you're taking advantage of my situation, Josephine said. I'm offering you a fair wage and a roof over your head. You want to call that taking advantage? That's your business. Josephine studied his profile in the fading light. The scar was even more prominent from the side. It looked like whatever had caused it had nearly taken his eye. His hands on the reins were steady, competent. He sat straight-backed but relaxed, like someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. The sheriff called you Vance, she said. What's your first name? Elias. I'm Josephine Carter. He nodded but didn't say anything else. More silence. The wagon creaked and rattled over the uneven ground. One of the horses snorted. The sheriff said people would talk, Josephine ventured, about you hiring me. People always talk. Doesn't mean I have to listen. What will they say? Elias was quiet for so long that Josephine thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, they'll say I'm a fool for trusting a stranger, that you'll rob me blind and disappear in the middle of the night, that you're probably a prostitute or a criminal or both, that I'm bringing shame on myself and my land. Josephine winced. And you don't care? I stopped caring what people think a long time ago. He glanced at her briefly, his dark eyes unreadable. Question is whether you care, because they'll say worse about you. A woman in your condition, living alone with a man who's not your husband, you'll be a pariah. I'm already a pariah. In Red Hollow, maybe, but word spreads. By next week, every town within 50 miles will know about you. Josephine considered this. He was right. Her reputation, such as it was, would be completely destroyed. No respectable family would ever hire her. No church would welcome her. She'd be marked as fallen, ruined, unsalvageable. But then, she'd already been marked that way the moment she fled her husband. There was no going back to respectability. There was only forward. I can live with that, she said. Elias nodded, apparently satisfied with her answer. They rode on into the darkness, following a rough trail that wound through the hills. The temperature continued to drop, and Josephine pulled her shawl tighter, wishing she had a proper coat. The baby kicked hard, as if protesting the cold in the jostling wagon. How far is your ranch? She asked. About 8 miles still. We'll get there around midnight at this pace. Midnight. Josephine's back was already aching from the wagon seat. She tried to shift into a more comfortable position, but there really wasn't one, Elias noticed. Without a word, he reached behind the seat and pulled out a thick wool blanket, handing it to her. Thank you, Josephine said, genuinely surprised. He just grunted in response. She wrapped the blanket around herself, immediately grateful for the warmth. It smelled like horse and hay and wood smoke. Not unpleasant, just earthy, real. You said you need a cook, Josephine said after a while. How many people am I cooking for? Depends on the season. Right now, 4 ranch hands. During spring roundup, could be as many as 10. And you want me to cook 3 meals a day for up to 10 men while 7 months pregnant? I want you to do what you can. If you can't manage, we'll figure something out. Josephine laughed, a short, sharp sound that was almost bitter. That's more reasonable than I expected. What were you expecting? I don't know. Cruelty, maybe. People haven't exactly been kind lately. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm not kind. Don't mistake practical for kind. You're useful to me, so I'm giving you a job. The day you stop being useful is the day you'll need to leave. At least you're honest. Always am. Lying takes too much energy. Despite everything, the cold, the exhaustion, the fear of what she was riding toward, Josephine found herself almost liking Elias Vance. He was harsh and blunt and completely lacking in social graces, but there was something refreshing about his directness. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled north. The rolling hills gave way to rockier terrain, with clusters of pine trees appearing more frequently. The trail became rougher, forcing Elias to slow the horses. Storm's coming, he said, looking at the sky. Josephine followed his gaze. The clouds that had been gathering earlier now covered most of the sky, blocking out the stars. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the smell of rain. Will we make it before it hits? Probably not. As if on cue, the first drops began to fall, fat, cold drops that hit Josephine's face like tiny needles. Within minutes, it was a steady downpour. The blanket helped, but water quickly soaked through, making her shiver. Elias urged the horses faster, but the trail was too treacherous to risk a full gallop in the dark. They continued at a steady pace, both of them getting progressively wetter and colder. Josephine's teeth started chattering. The baby was moving constantly now, clearly unhappy with the situation. Her hands were numb, her feet worse. She tried to focus on breathing, on staying conscious, on not falling off the wagon seat. "There," Elias said suddenly, pointing ahead. Through the rain, Josephine could just barely make out shapes in the darkness. Buildings, several of them, clustered around what looked like a central yard. Stone Ridge Ranch. The horses seemed to sense they were almost home, picking up their pace without being urged. They pulled into the yard and Elias brought them to a stop in front of the largest building, a two-story structure that was probably the main house. "Wait here," Elias said, jumping down. He disappeared into the darkness, and Josephine heard a door open, then light spilled out from inside the house. A moment later, Elias reappeared with a lantern. "Come on," he said, offering his hand again. Josephine took it, her legs nearly giving out when she tried to stand. Elias caught her easily, his arm supporting her weight. "You all right?" "Just cold and tired. I'll be fine." He helped her down from the wagon and half carried her to the house. The warmth inside hit her like a wall, blessed, beautiful warmth from a fire burning in a large stone hearth. The room was simple but functional. Wooden floors, plain furniture, a long table that could probably seat 12 people. Everything was clean but Spartan, like it had been built for utility rather than comfort. "Sit," Elias ordered, guiding her to a chair near the fire. Josephine sank into it gratefully, holding her hands out toward the flames. Feeling slowly returned to her fingers, accompanied by painful tingling. Elias draped another blanket over her shoulders, then disappeared deeper into the house. She heard him moving around, opening and closing doors, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floors. He returned with dry clothes, men's clothes, but clean. "There's a room upstairs, first door on the right. Get out of those wet things before you catch pneumonia." Josephine stood shakily, taking the clothes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen the work." She climbed the stairs slowly, her body protesting every step. The hallway was dark, but she found the first door on the right easily enough. The room was small, just a bed, a dresser, and a washstand. But it was clean, and when she lit the small lamp on the dresser, she saw that someone had already brought up her trunk. Josephine peeled off her wet clothes with numb fingers, then put on the dry shirt and pants Elias had given her. They were enormous on her, but they were warm, and that was all that mattered. She sat on the bed, intending to rest for just a moment before going back downstairs. She was asleep before her head hit the pillow. When Josephine woke, sunlight was streaming through the window, and she had no idea where she was for a confused, panicked moment. Then memory returned. Red Hollow, the rejection, Elias Vance, the wagon ride through the rain, the ranch. She sat up carefully, her body stiff and sore. The baby kicked, and she placed a hand on her belly, feeling the firm pressure of tiny feet against her palm. "We made it," she whispered. "We're safe. For now." The clothes she'd worn yesterday were hung neatly over the back of a chair. Someone had come in while she slept and taken them to dry. The thought of Elias creeping into her room while she was unconscious should have been alarming, but somehow it wasn't. She dressed in her own clothes, grateful they were dry, and made her way downstairs. The main room was empty, but she could hear voices outside. Through the window she saw Elias and 4 other men standing near the barn, discussing something. The men looked rough. Weathered faces, worn clothes, the kind of hard-edged appearance that comes from years of outdoor labor. The ranch hands. Josephine took a moment to look around the main room in daylight. It was bigger than she'd realized. The long table could probably seat 15 people comfortably. The kitchen was in the back corner with a large cast-iron stove that looked like it had been through a war. Shelves lined the walls, mostly empty except for a few basic supplies: flour, coffee, salt. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers. Josephine walked to the kitchen and started taking inventory. Flour, yes. Coffee, yes. Salt, bacon, dried beans, cornmeal. Some canned goods, a few sad-looking potatoes. Not much to work with, but she'd managed with less. She was examining the stove, trying to figure out how to work it, when the door opened and Elias walked in, followed by the 4 ranch hands. All conversation stopped as they saw her. "This is Mrs. Carter," Elias said, his tone making it clear he wouldn't tolerate any comments. "She's the new cook. You have questions? You ask her. You have problems. You keep them to yourself." The men stared at Josephine, their expressions ranging from surprise to suspicious to openly skeptical. "She know how to cook?" one of them asked, a man probably in his 40s with a thick beard and eyes that had seen too much. "That's what we're about to find out," Elias said. "Mrs. Carter, these are your workers. That's Cole." He pointed to the bearded man. "Marcus, Tommy, and Luis. They eat breakfast at 6, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. You're responsible for keeping them fed." Josephine looked at the 4 men, then at the pitiful supplies in the kitchen, then back at Elias. "I'll need to know what you have available. Livestock, stores, anything I can work with. We got cattle, chickens, a few pigs, root cellars out back stocked for winter. Anything else, you put it on a list and Cole picks it up in town once a week." "Which town?" "Red Hollow." Of course it was. "They won't sell to me," Josephine said. "Not after yesterday. They'll sell to Cole. He gives them money. They give him supplies. Nobody needs to know who's doing the cooking." It was a practical solution, even if it meant continuing to rely on people who despised her. "All right," Josephine said. "I can work with that, but I'll need a few hours to get organized." Elias nodded. "You got until noon, then I expect lunch for 5 people." It wasn't a request. The men filed out, leaving Josephine alone in the kitchen. She stood there for a moment, looking at the enormous task ahead of her. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The first thing Josephine did was start a proper fire in the stove. The second thing was find the root cellar Elias had mentioned. It took her 20 minutes of searching behind the house before she spotted the slanted wooden doors set into the ground, half hidden by overgrown weeds. She pulled one door open and descended the stone steps into cool darkness. The smell hit her immediately, earth and preservation, onions and apples stored for winter. Her eyes adjusted slowly, and she found herself in a surprisingly well-stocked space. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of preserved vegetables, smoked meat wrapped in cloth, wheels of cheese covered in wax. Bins held potatoes, turnips, carrots, onions. Not abundant, but enough to work with if she was careful. Josephine gathered what she needed for lunch, loading everything into a basket she found hanging by the door. Climbing back up the stairs was harder than going down. Her belly threw off her balance, and the baby seemed to think this was an excellent time to practice kicking her ribs. Back in the kitchen, she surveyed her supplies. Potatoes, onions, the bacon she'd found earlier, some dried herbs that looked like they'd been hanging there since before she was born. Not inspiring, but she'd make it work. She peeled and diced potatoes, moving carefully around the unfamiliar kitchen. The stove heated unevenly, hotter on the left side, cooler on the right. She'd have to remember that. The knives were dull enough to be dangerous. She'd sharpen them later if she could find a whetstone. By 11:30, she had a pot of soup simmering on the stove. Potato and bacon with onions, seasoned with what herbs she could salvage. Not fancy, but hot and filling. She'd also managed to bake a pan of cornbread, though it came out slightly burned on one side because of the stove's uneven heat. At exactly noon, the door opened and all 5 men filed in. They took seats at the long table without speaking, watching her with expressions that ranged from curious to openly doubtful. Josephine served the soup in chipped bowls, setting them down in front of each man, along with chunks of the cornbread. Her hands shook slightly. From exhaustion or nerves, she couldn't tell, but she kept her face neutral. The men stared at their bowls. "Problem?" Elias asked, looking at Cole. Cole picked up his spoon, dipped it into the soup, and took a cautious bite. His eyebrows rose slightly. He took another bite, then a third, this one larger. "It's good," he said, sounding surprised. The other men started eating, and Josephine felt a small knot of tension loosen in her chest. She served herself a smaller portion and sat at the far end of the table, trying not to notice how the men avoided looking directly at her. "Where'd you learn to cook?" Marcus asked. He was younger than Cole, maybe late 20s, with a scar across his knuckles that looked like it came from a blade. "My mother," Josephine said, "before she died." "She teach you anything else?" Tommy asked. He couldn't be more than 20, with red hair and freckles that made him look even younger. "Tommy," Elias's voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut. Tommy ducked his head. "Just asking." "Well, don't." They finished the meal in silence. When the men stood to leave, Cole paused by Josephine's chair. "Need anything from town this week?" Josephine thought quickly. "Salt, more flour, coffee if you can get it, eggs, and I'll need meat, beef or pork, whatever's available." Cole nodded. "I'll see what I can do." After they left, Josephine cleared the table and washed the dishes in a bucket of water she'd hauled from the well. Her back screamed in protest, but she ignored it. There was too much work to do to start complaining now. She spent the afternoon exploring the ranch, getting a sense of the layout. The main house sat in the center, with the barn to the east, a smaller bunkhouse to the west where the ranch hands slept, and various storage sheds scattered around the property. Beyond the buildings, she could see cattle grazing on the brown hills, small dark shapes against the endless sky. It was isolated in a way that should have been frightening. The nearest neighbor was probably miles away. The nearest town was Red Hollow, and she knew what kind of welcome she'd get there. If something went wrong, if Elias turned out to be dangerous, if the ranch hands decided they didn't want her around, there would be nowhere to run. But Josephine had learned that danger came in many forms. Sometimes the most dangerous thing was the familiar. That evening, she made dinner from the supplies she'd found. A beef stew that had been simmering since mid-afternoon, more cornbread, and coffee so strong it could strip paint. The men ate without complaint, and this time there were a few muttered thank yous as they filed out. Elias stayed behind, pouring himself another cup of coffee. "You did good today," he said. Josephine looked up from the dishes, surprised. "Thank you. Don't let it go to your head. Tomorrow will be harder." "I figured as much." He studied her for a moment, his scarred face unreadable in the lamplight. "You always this calm." "What do you mean?" "Most women in your situation would be crying or complaining or trying to run back to town. You just work." Josephine dried her hands on a towel. "Crying doesn't change anything, complaining doesn't help, and I've got nowhere to run back to." "Fair enough." Elias stood, draining the last of his coffee. "You need anything? You let me know. Otherwise, keep doing what you're doing." He left before she could respond. The days that followed established a rhythm. Josephine woke before dawn to start breakfast. Eggs when they had them, porridge when they didn't, always coffee and some kind of bread or biscuits. The men ate quickly and headed out to work. She spent the mornings cleaning, doing laundry in a wooden tub that made her back ache, and preparing lunch. Afternoons were for mending clothes, planning dinner, and stealing a few precious hours of rest when her body demanded it. It was hard work, harder than anything she'd done before, but it was also strangely satisfying. There was a simplicity to it: cook, clean, sleep, repeat. No complicated social rules to navigate. No husband to placate. No carefully constructed lies to maintain. Just work. Cole returned from town after 3 days with the supplies she'd requested. He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Josephine asked. "Medicine, from Doc Morrison. Said you should take it daily." Cole's face reddened slightly. "For the baby." Josephine opened the package to find a bottle of iron tablets and a note written in shaky handwriting. "For anemia, common in late pregnancy. 1 daily with food, no charge." She felt something catch in her throat. The doctor had never even met her, but he'd sent medicine anyway. A small kindness in a place where kindness seemed in short supply. "Tell him thank you," she said quietly. Cole nodded and left. That evening, Josephine made chicken and dumplings using one of the scrawny birds she'd found in the coop. It wasn't much to look at, but it tasted like home, or at least like her memory of home, which was probably better than the reality had ever been. Luis, who rarely spoke, cleared his throat after finishing his second helping. "My mother used to make this." "Yeah?" Josephine said. "In Sonora, before we came north." He stared at his empty bowl. "I haven't had it in 15 years. I can make it again sometime. I'd like that." It was a small moment, barely worth noting, but Josephine filed it away as proof that she was making progress. The men were starting to see her as something other than an inconvenience or curiosity. As the weeks passed, the ranch began to feel less foreign. She learned which floorboards creaked, which window stuck when you tried to open it, which burner on the stove ran hottest. She learned that Marcus had nightmares that made him wake up shouting, that Tommy was afraid of horses despite working with them daily, that Luis could speak 3 languages but chose silence most of the time. And she learned about Elias. He was up before everyone else, working long after the others had quit for the day. He rarely spoke unless necessary, and when he did, his words were direct and often harsh. But he was also fair. If someone did good work, he acknowledged it. If they screwed up, he told them exactly how and expected them better next time. The scar on his face was from a knife fight in Denver, according to Cole. The fight had started over a card game and ended with 3 men dead and Elias barely alive. He'd spent 2 months recovering, then drifted south, and eventually bought this land with money no one asked about. "He's not a good man," Cole told Josephine one afternoon while she was hanging laundry. "But he's not evil either, just careful. Real careful about who he trusts." "Why did he hire me then?" Josephine asked. "He doesn't know me." "Maybe that's why. You're not from here. You don't have history with anyone. You can't betray secrets you don't know." It made a strange kind of sense. Josephine was almost 7 weeks into her stay at Stone Ridge when the baby started moving differently. Less kicking, more rolling, lower. She mentioned it to no one, but she knew what it meant. Time was running short. She was kneading bread dough one morning when the cramping started. Not contractions, just a dull ache that radiated from her lower back through her hips. She gritted her teeth and kept working, but her movements became slower, more careful. Elias noticed at lunch. "You all right?" he asked after the other men had left. "Fine. You're moving like you got broken ribs." "I'm pregnant. Everything hurts." He didn't look convinced but didn't push. "If you need rest, take it." "I'll rest when the work's done." "That's not how this works." Josephine slammed the dish she was washing into the bucket harder than necessary. "Then how does it work? You hired me to cook and clean. If I stop doing that, I'm not earning my keep." "I hired you to not die in the street." The cooking was secondary. The bluntness of it stopped her cold. She turned to look at him, really look at him, and for the first time saw something other than harsh practicality in his expression. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you really offer me that job?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My sister got pregnant young. No husband, no family support. She went to 3 different towns looking for work, and every single one turned her away." He stared at his hands. "She died that winter, her and the baby both. Froze to death in an abandoned barn outside Wichita." Josephine's breath caught. "Elias, I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was 20 years ago, but when I saw you sitting on that trunk in Red Hollow, I saw her, and I couldn't just walk away. So this is about your sister, not me. Maybe. Does it matter? I don't know." He stood, grabbing his hat from the peg by the door. "Take the afternoon off. Rest." "That's an order, not a suggestion." Josephine wanted to argue, but the pain in her back was getting worse. She nodded and watched him leave. She made it upstairs to her room before the first real contraction hit, a wave of pressure so intense it drove her to her knees. She gripped the bedpost, breathing through it, counting seconds until it passed. Not yet. It was too early. She still had 3 weeks, maybe 4. The contraction faded, leaving her shaking. She managed to climb onto the bed, lying on her side, trying to will her body to stop whatever it was starting. But her body had other plans. The contractions came sporadically over the next few hours, sometimes 20 minutes apart, sometimes an hour. They weren't regular enough to be true labor, but they were strong enough to steal her breath every time. She didn't tell anyone. What would she say? That she might be going into early labor but couldn't be sure? That she was terrified because she'd never done this before and had no idea what to expect? By evening, the contractions had mostly stopped. Josephine forced herself downstairs to make dinner, moving carefully, trying not to jostle anything that might restart the process. The men noticed something was off. They ate quickly and quietly, shooting worried glances at each other and at her. After they left, Elias stayed behind again. "You need a doctor," he said flatly. I'm fine. You're pale as milk and shaking. You're not fine. It's just false labor. Happens sometimes. And what if it's not false? Josephine met his eyes. Then I deal with it, same as everything else. That's not... He stopped, frustration clear on his face. You can't just tough your way through childbirth. Women do it every day. Women die every day too. The harshness of it hit her like a slap. But he wasn't wrong. What do you want me to do? Josephine asked. Ride back to Red Hollow and beg that doctor to help me? Assuming he even would? I'll send Cole tomorrow. He'll bring Doc Morrison here. And if the doctor refuses? Then Cole makes it very clear that refusing isn't an option. It should have frightened her, this casual mention of coercion, but instead Josephine felt something close to relief. Someone was taking this seriously. Someone was planning ahead, instead of just hoping for the best. Okay, she said quietly. Send Cole. Cole left at dawn the next morning, riding hard toward Red Hollow. Josephine spent the day trying to act normal, but every twinge, every ache made her wonder if this was it. The contractions didn't come back, though. By evening, she was starting to think maybe it had been false labor after all. Her body playing tricks, testing systems that would be needed soon, but not quite yet. Cole returned just after sunset with Doc Morrison in tow. The doctor was older than Josephine expected, probably 70, with white hair and liver-spotted hands that shook slightly. But his eyes were sharp and kind, and when he looked at Josephine, she didn't see judgment. Let's have a look at you, he said, setting his bag on the table. Elias and the other men made themselves scarce, while Doc Morrison examined Josephine in her room. He listened to the baby's heartbeat with a wooden tube, pressed on her belly with careful hands, asked questions about her symptoms. Baby's positioned wrong, he said finally. Breech. That's why you're having the pains. Your body's trying to get ready, but the baby's not cooperating. Josephine's stomach dropped. What does that mean? Means when labor starts for real, it's going to be difficult, maybe dangerous. Breech births are tricky even with help. Out here, he trailed off, but she understood. Can you turn the baby? I can try. Won't be pleasant. I don't care. Just do it. Doc Morrison had her lie flat on the bed, then placed his hands on her belly. What followed was the most painful 10 minutes of Josephine's life. He pushed and manipulated, trying to rotate the baby into the correct position. She bit down on a leather strap he'd given her to keep from screaming. Finally, he stopped. Sorry, baby's stubborn. Won't budge. Josephine's eyes were wet with tears she hadn't let fall. So what now? Now we wait. When labor starts, I come back. We do what we can. He packed up his instruments. You got anyone who can help? Someone with experience? No? Then I'll leave instructions with Vance. Basic stuff. How to recognize real labor. What to do if things go wrong. What if you can't get here in time? Doc Morrison's expression was gentle but honest. Then Vance does his best, and we hope that's enough. Downstairs, Josephine could hear the doctor giving Elias detailed instructions. She caught fragments. If the bleeding is excessive, cord around the neck. Breech extraction. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Doc Morrison left an hour later, taking with him Cole's promise to fetch him immediately when labor began. Elias walked upstairs and knocked on Josephine's door. Come in, she called. He entered but stayed near the doorway, as if unsure how close to get. Doc said you should stay in bed for a few days. Let things settle. I have work to do. The work will still be there. Your health won't if you push too hard. Josephine wanted to argue, but she was too tired. Fine. A few days. I'll have the men bring meals up to you. That's not necessary. It's happening anyway. He turned to leave, then paused. The doctor also said you're strong, that you've got a good chance. Did he tell you about the breach? Yes. And you're not worried? Elias's scarred face was unreadable. I'm always worried. Doesn't change anything. We prepare for the worst and hope for the best. After he left, Josephine lay in the dark, one hand on her belly, feeling the baby move. Wrong position or not, the baby was alive and strong. That had to count for something. The days of forced rest were torture. Josephine hated lying in bed while she could hear the men downstairs trying to cook for themselves. The first day they made coffee so bitter it could dissolve spoons and burned the bacon to charcoal. The second day, Luis attempted biscuits that came out hard enough to use as ammunition. On the third day, Josephine couldn't take it anymore. She got up, got dressed, and went downstairs despite Elias's orders. The men were in the kitchen, staring at a pot of something that looked like it had died a painful death. "Out," Josephine said. They scrambled to obey, relief clear on their faces. She salvaged what she could of their attempts and made a proper breakfast. When Elias came in and saw her at the stove, his jaw tightened. "You're supposed to be resting." "I rested. I'm fine now." Doc Morrison said, "Doc Morrison doesn't live here." "I do." She cracked eggs into a pan with more force than necessary. "I'm not going to lie in bed for weeks just because something might happen. When labor starts, I'll deal with it. Until then, I work." They stared at each other across the kitchen, neither willing to back down. Finally, Elias nodded. "Your choice. But if you collapse, I'm carrying you back to bed and locking the door." "Fair enough." The tension between them eased slightly after that. Josephine noticed Elias watching her more carefully, ready to intervene if she showed signs of overexertion. But he didn't try to stop her from working. 2 more weeks passed. Josephine's belly grew impossibly larger. The baby's movements became more pronounced, elbows and knees pressing against her skin from the inside, creating strange ripples that fascinated and terrified her in equal measure. She was hanging laundry one afternoon when the first snowflakes began to fall. Big, fat flakes that drifted down lazily, melting when they hit the still warm ground. Winter was coming. By evening, the snow was falling steadily. The men came in from their work covered in white, shaking it off like wet dogs. "Storm's moving in fast," Cole reported to Elias. "Could be a bad one." "How bad?" "Bad enough we might be stuck here for a few days once it really hits." Elias glanced at Josephine. She knew what he was thinking. If she went into labor during a blizzard, Doc Morrison wouldn't be able to reach them. It would just be Elias and whatever half-remembered instructions the doctor had given him. "Make sure we're stocked up," Elias said. "Firewood, food, water, anything we might need. I want to be ready." The men nodded and headed back out into the snow. Josephine continued preparing dinner, trying to ignore the cramping that had started in her lower back. Probably nothing, just her body practicing again. But as the evening wore on, the cramping got worse and more regular. She didn't say anything during dinner. The men ate and left as usual. Elias stayed behind, and Josephine could feel his eyes on her as she cleaned up. "How far apart?" he asked quietly. She froze. "What?" "The contractions, how far apart?" There was no point lying. 15 minutes, maybe 20. That's real labor. Maybe. Or maybe it's just more false starts. "Josephine." He waited until she looked at him. "Is this it?" She took a slow breath, placed a hand on her belly, and felt the tight hardness that signaled another contraction building. "Yeah, I think it is." Outside, the snow fell harder. Inside, the fire crackled. And somewhere between those two spaces, Josephine's baby had decided it was time to be born, ready or not. Elias moved toward the door, already reaching for his coat. "I'll get Cole. He can ride to town." "No." Josephine gripped the edge of the table as another contraction built, harder this time. "Look outside." Through the window, the world had disappeared into white. The snow was coming down so thick you couldn't see the barn 20 yards away. The wind had picked up too, howling around the corners of the house like something alive and angry. Elias stared at the storm, his jaw working. He could still make it. He'd die trying. You know that. The contraction peaked and Josephine bit down hard on her lip, tasting copper. She counted seconds, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 40, before it finally eased enough for her to breathe again. When she opened her eyes, Elias was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Fear, maybe. Or something close to it. "You remember what Doc Morrison told you?" she asked. "Most of it." "Most isn't good enough. It's going to have to be." He took off his coat and hung it back on the peg. "Can you make it upstairs?" "I think so." He offered his arm and she took it, grateful for the support as they climbed the stairs. Each step sent jolts of pain through her lower back and hips. The baby felt impossibly low now, pressing down with a weight that made her legs shake. In her room, Elias helped her onto the bed, then stood there looking lost in a way she'd never seen him look before. "What do you need?" he asked. "Clean sheets, towels, hot water, lots of it. Something to cut the cord with, but it needs to be boiled first to kill any infection." She paused as another contraction started. "And you might want to get the other men, just in case." "In case of what?" Josephine met his eyes. "In case this goes wrong and you need help burying me." His face went pale under the scar. "Don't talk like that." "I'm not being dramatic. I'm being practical. The baby's breech, Elias. Even with a doctor that's dangerous, without one." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He left without another word, and she heard him moving through the house, gathering supplies. Heard him go outside into the storm. Heard voices raised against the wind. A few minutes later, footsteps on the stairs. Multiple sets. Cole, Marcus, Tommy, and Luis filed into the room, snow still clinging to their clothes. They stood against the wall looking uncomfortable and terrified. "She might need you," Elias told them. "If things get bad, if I can't handle it alone, you do what I say without question. Understood?" They all nodded. Josephine wanted to tell them they could leave, that this wasn't their problem, but another contraction stole her breath before she could speak. This one was stronger than the last, a band of iron tightening around her middle, squeezing until she thought her spine might snap. 45 seconds. They were getting longer. When it passed, she found Marcus holding out a cup of water. She took it with shaking hands and drank, the cold liquid soothing her throat. "How far apart now?" Elias asked. Josephine glanced at the clock on the dresser. 12 minutes, maybe less. "Is that good or bad?" "It means the baby's coming whether we're ready or not." Over the next hour, the contractions got closer together and more intense. Josephine walked when she could, trying to help things progress. Sat when she couldn't. Gripped the bedpost and breathed through the worst ones while the men watched in silent horror. She'd thought she understood pain. Her husband had broken 2 of her ribs once, blackened both her eyes, split her lips so badly she'd needed stitches. But this was different. This was her own body turning against her, muscles contracting with a force that felt inhuman. 10 minutes, she gasped after checking the clock again. Outside, the storm raged. Wind threw snow against the windows hard enough to rattle the glass. The temperature in the room dropped despite the fire Elias had built in the small hearth. Luis brought up hot water in a large pot, steam rising from the surface. Tommy appeared with an armful of clean towels. Cole had found scissors and a ball of string, both of which Elias dropped into the boiling water. "What else?" Elias asked Josephine. "What else do we need?" "Luck," she said, then doubled over as another contraction hit. This one was different. Stronger, yes, but also accompanied by a sensation she hadn't felt before. Pressure. Immense and undeniable, like the baby was trying to force its way out through sheer will. "Something's happening," she managed to say. "I need to push." "Already?" Elias looked panicked. "It hasn't been that long." "I don't think the baby cares about timelines." Josephine gripped the bedpost harder. "Help me up. I can't do this lying down." Between contractions, the men helped her into a squatting position, supported by Marcus on one side and Cole on the other. It wasn't dignified, and it sure as hell wasn't comfortable, but every instinct she had said this was right. The next contraction came, and with it an overwhelming urge to push. Josephine bore down, feeling something shift inside her. Not the baby moving down like it should, but something else. Something wrong. When the contraction ended, she was panting and dizzy. "Elias, check. Tell me what you see." He looked like he'd rather face down a pack of wolves, but he moved to where he could see between her legs. His face went from pale to gray. I can see something, but it's not the head." Josephine's heart sank. "What is it?" "Looks like feet? Small feet." "Breech, just like Doc Morrison had said." The baby was coming out backward, which meant every push would be fighting gravity instead of working with it. Meant the head, the largest part, would be coming last, with no way to ease it through. Meant this was going to be bad. "Okay," Josephine said, trying to keep her voice steady, even though she wanted to scream. "Okay. When the next contraction comes, I'm going to push again. You need to support the baby as it comes out. Don't pull, just support. Let my body do the work." Josephine, I don't know if I can. You can. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw beneath the fear to the man who'd faced down armed men in Denver, who'd built a life out of nothing in this harsh place. You can because you have to. The contraction built slowly this time, giving her a few seconds to prepare. Then it crashed over her like a wave, and she pushed with everything she had. I can see more, Elias said, his voice tight. The legs are coming, slowly. The contraction ended, and Josephine sagged against Marcus and Cole, gasping. Her body was shaking, sweat running down her face despite the cold. How much longer? Tommy asked from somewhere behind her. However long it takes, Elias said sharply. Another contraction. Another push. Josephine felt something give, felt the baby slide forward another inch or two. The pressure was incredible, burning and stretching in ways that made her vision go white at the edges. That's it, Elias said. You're doing it. The baby's coming. 3 more contractions, 3 more pushes that left Josephine shaking and weak. But with each one, the baby moved a little more. Elias kept up a running commentary. The legs were out, now the hips, now the torso. I can see the arms, he said. They're tucked against the chest. That's good, right? Yes, Josephine panted. That's good. Just the head left. But the head was the problem. In a normal birth, the head came first, slowly stretching everything to accommodate its size. In a breech birth, the head came last, and there was no time for gradual adjustment. It either came through or it didn't, and if it didn't, the baby would die. Maybe Josephine too. Next contraction, she said. I'm going to push as hard as I can. You need to support the baby's body. Don't let it hang down. That puts pressure on the cord. Elias's hands were shaking as he supported the tiny body that was now halfway into the world. I've got it. The contraction hit, and Josephine pushed until she thought something inside her would tear. The burning intensified, became agony, became something beyond pain that she had no words for. It's stuck, Elias said, and there was real panic in his voice now. The head's stuck. Don't pull, Josephine gasped. You'll break the neck. Just wait. But waiting meant the baby wasn't breathing. Waiting meant precious seconds ticking away with the cord compressed, oxygen cut off. Tell me what to do, Elias demanded. Josephine, tell me what to do. She tried to remember what Doc Morrison had said about breech births, tried to think through the fog of pain and exhaustion. Something about the head being tilted wrong, about needing to adjust the angle. Put your fingers along the jaw, she said. Gently. Feel which way the chin is pointing. Elias did as she instructed, his face a mask of concentration. It's pointing down, tucked against the chest. You need to tilt it, slowly, just enough to change the angle. I could hurt. The baby will die if you don't try. The words came out harsher than she intended, but there was no time for gentleness. Do it now. Elias took a breath, then carefully placed his fingers along the baby's tiny jaw. Josephine felt him adjust the position, felt something shift inside her. Is it working? She asked. I don't know. Maybe. Try pushing again. The next contraction was weaker than the others, her body running out of strength. But Josephine bore down anyway, giving it everything she had left. Something gave. The burning became searing, white-hot pain, and then suddenly there was release. Pressure gone, weight gone, just emptiness where the baby had been, and silence. Terrible, absolute silence. Josephine's vision cleared enough to see Elias holding a tiny, blue-tinged body, not moving, not crying, just limp and still in his large, scarred hands. No, she whispered. No, no, no. Elias laid the baby on one of the clean towels, his movements quick and sure. He turned the tiny body over, swept a finger through the mouth to clear any fluid, then leaned down and breathed gently into the small face. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. Cole made a sound like a wounded animal. Tommy turned away, his shoulders shaking. Luis closed his eyes and moved his lips in what might have been prayer. Elias breathed into the baby again, then placed 2 fingers on the tiny chest and pressed gently, rhythmically. Josephine had seen him do this once when a calf was born not breathing, quick, light compressions paired with breaths. Come on, he muttered. Come on, damn you. Breathe. 5 compressions.
1 breath. 5 compressions. 1 breath. Josephine couldn't look away, couldn't breathe herself. Everything had narrowed down to that small, still form, and Elias's hands moving over it with desperate precision. 5 compressions. 1 breath. The baby twitched. Elias froze. Did you see? Another twitch, stronger this time. The tiny chest rose, fell, rose again, and then a sound, weak and sputtering at first, but growing stronger. A cry. High-pitched and angry, and absolutely perfect. The baby's color changed from blue to pink, small fists waving in the air, alive, breathing, screaming its fury at being born into this cold, harsh world. Josephine started crying and couldn't stop. Relief, joy, exhaustion, all of it pouring out in gasping sobs that shook her whole body. Elias cut the cord with the boiled scissors, tied it off with string, then wrapped the baby in a clean towel and brought it to Josephine. "It's a girl," he said, his voice rough. "You have a daughter." Josephine took the bundle in shaking arms, looked down at the tiny face scrunched up in outrage. She was small, too small probably from coming early, but her cry was strong, and her eyes, when they opened briefly, were dark and alert. "Hello," Josephine whispered. "Hello, little one. I'm your mother." The baby's crying quieted at the sound of her voice, replaced by small snuffling sounds. One tiny hand worked free of the towel, and Josephine offered her finger. The baby's hand closed around it with surprising strength. "She's got a grip," Marcus said, moving closer to see. His tough, weathered face was wet with tears he didn't bother hiding. "Strong," Cole agreed. "Took after her mother." Tommy laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "I thought we lost her. I really thought—" "But we didn't," Luis said quietly. "She's here." Elias had stepped back, giving the other men room to crowd around and marvel at the tiny life that had nearly slipped away. Josephine caught his eye over their heads and mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." He nodded once, then turned away to tend to the fire, but not before she saw his hands shaking. The afterbirth came a few minutes later with a final contraction that made Josephine grit her teeth, but was nothing compared to what had come before. Elias dealt with it efficiently while Marcus helped Josephine into a clean nightgown and changed the bloody sheets. By the time everything was settled, Josephine was so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open. But she refused to let go of the baby, refused to put her down even for a moment. "You need to sleep," Elias said. "I need to make sure she's still breathing." "She's breathing fine. Listen to her." The baby was making small grunting sounds, rooting around for food. Josephine shifted the nightgown and helped the tiny mouth find what it was searching for. The sensation was strange and uncomfortable at first, but the baby latched on with determined efficiency. "Natural," Cole observed. "She knows what to do." "Babies usually do," Elias said. "It's the rest of us who need instructions." Outside, the storm continued to rage. Inside, the room was warm and quiet, except for the crackling fire and the small sounds of the baby nursing. The men left one by one, heading back to the bunkhouse after extracting promises from Elias that he'd call if anything changed. Tommy paused at the door, looking back at Josephine and the baby. "What are you going to name her?" he asked. Josephine hadn't thought that far ahead, had barely let herself believe the baby would survive long enough to need a name. She looked down at the small face, peaceful now that she was fed and warm. "Grace," she said finally. "Her name is Grace." It felt right. After everything they'd been through, the rejection, the fear, the desperate flight to this isolated place, grace was what had saved them. Not the religious kind, but the everyday kind. The grace of a stranger offering help. The grace of time, giving them just enough to prepare. The grace of 5 men who could have walked away but chose to stay and help bring a life into the world. "Grace," Tommy repeated. "That's real pretty." After he left, Elias pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down heavily. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning, exhausted in a way that went deeper than just physical tiredness. "You should sleep too," Josephine said. "I will. Just want to make sure you're both stable first." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm. Grace had fallen asleep at Josephine's breast, her tiny face completely relaxed. Josephine carefully adjusted the blanket around her, making sure she was warm. I thought we lost her, Elias said quietly. When she came out, not breathing, I thought, but you didn't give up. I didn't know what else to do. Figured if it worked on calves, maybe it would work on babies too. Josephine laughed, a weak sound. I'm glad you didn't mention that before you tried it. Would you have stopped me? No, but I would have been even more terrified than I already was. She looked at him, really looked at him. You saved her life. You saved both our lives. You did most of the work. I couldn't have done it without you. Elias stood up, clearly uncomfortable with the gratitude. Get some rest. I'll be downstairs if you need anything. Elias, she waited until he turned back. Your sister, the one who died. What was her name? His expression went distant. Sarah May Vance. I'm sorry you couldn't save her, but you saved us. That has to count for something. He didn't answer, just nodded and left the room. Josephine heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard him moving around in the kitchen below. She settled back against the pillows, Grace warm and solid in her arms. Every muscle in her body ached. She was bleeding still, though not as heavily as before. Her hands were shaking with exhaustion. But she was alive. Grace was alive. They'd survived something that should have killed them both. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. The wind screaming now, rattling the windows in their frames. Snow piled up against the glass, blocking out what little light the moon might have provided. They were trapped here. No way to get word to Doc Morrison that the baby had been born. No way to know if the birth had caused damage that would show up later. No way to do anything except wait and hope. Josephine looked down at Grace's sleeping face and felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her. This tiny person had fought to be born, had clawed her way into the world against terrible odds. She deserved better than to die in the first few days of life. I won't let anything happen to you, Josephine whispered. Whatever it takes, I'll keep you safe. Grace stirred slightly, made a small sound, then settled back into sleep. Josephine finally let herself close her eyes. Just for a moment, she told herself. Just long enough to catch her breath. She woke to pale gray light filtering through the window and Grace crying, not the angry wails from last night, but a fretful, hungry sound. Josephine's body felt like it had been trampled by horses, but she forced herself to sit up and tend to the baby. Grace nursed eagerly, her small hands kneading against Josephine's chest. When she was finished, Josephine changed the cloth diaper that Louise had fashioned from torn sheets, noting that everything seemed to be working as it should. Footsteps on the stairs. Elias appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with food, eggs, toast, coffee. How are you feeling? He asked. Like I gave birth in the middle of a blizzard, Josephine said, but alive. The storm stopped around dawn. We got maybe 3 feet of snow. Roads are completely blocked. So we're stuck. For now, Cole's going to try to get to Red Hollow tomorrow if the weather holds. Let Doc Morrison know everything worked out. Elias set the tray on the small table beside the bed. Josephine realized she was starving, hadn't eaten since before the labor started. She managed to eat one-handed, Grace dozing in the crook of her other arm. The men want to know if they can visit, Elias said. See how Grace is doing. Tell them yes, just not all at once. Over the course of the day, each of the ranch hands came up to check on the baby. They brought small offerings. Tommy had carved a rattle from a piece of wood. Luis presented a tiny knitted cap that he swore his mother had taught him to make years ago. Marcus offered a silver dollar for luck. And Cole awkwardly handed over a small stuffed horse made from scraps of leather. Josephine was touched by the gifts, by the genuine care in these rough men's faces. They'd gone from viewing her as an inconvenience to something else. Family, maybe. Or at least the beginning of one. By the second day, Josephine felt strong enough to get out of bed for short periods. Her body was still healing, the bleeding had slowed but not stopped, and every movement sent aches radiating through her core. But she needed to move, needed to prove to herself that she could. Grace seemed to be thriving. She nursed well, slept in reasonable stretches, and already had a personality, demanding when hungry, peaceful when content, and utterly unimpressed by anything that didn't directly concern her comfort. On the third day, Cole managed to ride to Red Hollow and back. He returned with Doc Morrison,
who examined both Josephine and Grace thoroughly. "Well, I'll be damned," the doctor said, shaking his head in amazement. "You actually pulled it off, both alive, both healthy. That's a minor miracle." "It wasn't a miracle," Josephine said. "It was Elias." Doc Morrison turned to where Elias stood by the door. "You remember everything I told you?" "Most of it. Made some things up as I went." "Whatever you did, it worked." The doctor closed his bag. "You got lucky, though. Next time—" "There won't be a next time," Josephine said firmly. The doctor raised an eyebrow. "You say that now." After he left, Josephine sat with Grace in the rocking chair by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. The world looked clean, almost peaceful under all that white. Hard to believe that just a few days ago, she'd been fighting for both their lives. The door opened and Elias came in, pausing when he saw them by the window. "Everything all right?" he asked. "More than all right." Josephine smiled down at Grace. "We made it. Against all the odds, we actually made it." Elias crossed the room to stand beside the chair. He looked down at the baby, his scarred face soft in the afternoon light. "She's tough," he said, "like her mother. She'll need to be. The world isn't kind to girls without fathers." The moment the words left her mouth, Josephine wished she could take them back. She hadn't meant to bring up the subject, hadn't meant to acknowledge the precarious position she and Grace were in. But Elias didn't seem offended. If anything, he looked thoughtful. "No," he agreed. "It's not." They stood there for a long moment, both looking at the sleeping baby, both thinking about the uncertain future stretching ahead. Neither of them knew it yet, but that future was about to get a lot more complicated. Because 200 miles south, a man was reading a telegram that would change everything. A man who had every legal right to the child sleeping peacefully in Josephine's arms. A man who had no intention of letting his property, because that's what he considered them, property, slip away without a fight. But for now, in this quiet moment, Josephine and Elias and Grace existed in a bubble of peace. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the fire crackled. And a tiny baby breathed steadily, unaware of the storm that was coming. The rider came 3 weeks after Grace was born, appearing on the horizon like a dark smudge against the white landscape. Marcus spotted him first from the barn and came running to the house. "Someone's coming," he said, bursting through the door. "Looks official." Elias was at the window before Marcus finished speaking. Josephine stood from the rocking chair where she'd been feeding Grace, her heart already racing. "Can you tell who it is?" she asked. "Not yet, but he's riding hard." Elias turned to Marcus. "Get Cole and the others. I want everyone here." Marcus left at a run. Josephine wrapped Grace in the blanket Louise had knitted and held her close, trying to calm the panic rising in her chest. She'd known this peace couldn't last, had known that eventually someone would come looking. The rider got closer. Through the window, Josephine could make out details now. A man in a long coat, expensive looking even from a distance. Not a rancher, not anyone from Red Hollow. He pulled up in front of the house and dismounted with practiced ease. Mid-40s, well-dressed, clean-shaven, he tied his horse to the post and walked toward the door like he owned the place. Elias opened it before the man could knock. "Help you?" His tone was flat, unwelcoming. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking for Josephine Carter. I was told she might be here." "Who's asking?" "My name is Richard Ashford. I'm an attorney from Kansas City." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I represent Mr. Thomas Whitmore. Perhaps Mrs. Whitmore would like to come out and speak with me." Josephine's blood turned to ice. She'd never used her married name at the ranch, had introduced herself as Carter, her maiden name, the name of a person who no longer belonged to Thomas. "There's no Mrs. Whitmore here," Elias said. Ashford's smile got colder. "Then perhaps the woman who was born Josephine Carter and who married Thomas Whitmore in March of 1884. The woman who is currently wanted by her husband for abandonment of her lawful marriage." "Abandonment!" Josephine's voice came out sharper than she intended. She moved to stand beside Elias, Grace tight in her arms. "Is that what he's calling it?" Ashford looked at her with the kind of assessment lawyers do, cataloging every detail, looking for weaknesses. His gaze lingered on Grace. "Mrs. Whitmore, your husband has been searching for you for months. He's been quite worried." "I'm sure he has." Josephine's grip on Grace tightened. What does he want? He wants his wife to come home. And his child. Ashford gestured to Grace. That is his child, isn't it? Born of your marriage? Get off my property. Elias's voice was quiet, but carried an edge that made Ashford take a step back. I'm afraid I can't do that. Not without Mrs. Whitmore and the child. He unfolded the paper he'd been holding. I have a court order here, signed by Judge Hammond in Kansas City. It grants Mr. Whitmore full custody of any children born of the marriage and demands the return of his wife to the marital home. Josephine felt the floor tilt under her feet. No, you can't. The law is quite clear, Mrs. Whitmore. A wife's place is with her husband. A child belongs to its father. You have no legal right to either yourself or the baby. The hell she doesn't. Elias moved forward, putting himself between Josephine and the lawyer. That paper's worth nothing out here. Kansas City judge has no jurisdiction in this territory. Ashford's smile turned smug. Actually, Mr. Whitmore anticipated that argument. He also obtained orders from judges in 3 territories, including this one. Judge Blackwell in Denver was very sympathetic to a husband's plight. Blackwell's a drunk and a fool, Elias said. Everyone knows it. Perhaps. But he's also a legally appointed judge, whose orders must be honored. Ashford tucked the paper back into his coat. Now, Mrs. Whitmore, if you'll gather your things, we can leave immediately. Mr. Whitmore is waiting in Red Hollow with a proper carriage for the journey home. He's here. Thomas is here. The knowledge hit Josephine like a physical blow. She'd thought she had more time, thought she'd be able to disappear into the frontier and never be found. But Thomas had money and connections, and apparently he'd used both to track her down. I'm not going anywhere with you, she said, forcing her voice steady even though she was shaking. Then I'll have to return with the sheriff and remove you and the child by force. Is that what you want? A scene in front of these men? The child traumatized by violence? Grace chose that moment to start crying, as if she could sense the tension in the room. Josephine rocked her automatically, but her eyes never left Ashford. You tell Thomas he can go to hell, she said. I'm not his wife anymore. I'm not his anything. The law disagrees. And if you refuse to comply voluntarily, Mr. Whitmore is prepared to take more aggressive action. He can have you arrested for kidnapping. He can have criminal charges filed against anyone who aids you in keeping his child from him. Ashford glanced meaningfully at Elias. That would include you, Mr. Vance, harboring a fugitive, interfering with a father's legal rights. Those are serious crimes. The door opened and Cole, Tommy, Luis, and Marcus filed in, all of them armed. Ashford's eyes widened slightly, but he held his ground. Threatening me with violence would be extremely unwise, he said. Mr. Whitmore has friends in very high places. If anything happens to me, there will be consequences. No one's threatening you, Elias said. We're just making sure you leave the way you came, alone. Ashford looked around at the 5 men and 1 woman facing him. Whatever he saw in their expressions made him reconsider his approach. Very well. I'll return to Red Hollow and inform Mr. Whitmore of your decision. But this isn't over, Mrs. Whitmore. The law is on his side. You can run, but you can't hide forever. He tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness. I'll give you until tomorrow morning to reconsider. After that, we'll be forced to take more direct action. He left, mounting his horse and riding back the way he'd come. They all watched until he disappeared over the ridge. Son of a bitch, Cole muttered. He can't really take Grace, can he? Tommy asked, looking at Josephine with something like fear in his eyes. The law's on his side, Marcus said grimly. Man has rights to his wife and children. Doesn't matter if he's a good man or not. There has to be something we can do. Luis looked at Elias. Some way to fight this. Elias was staring out the window, his jaw tight. Josephine, tell me the truth. Is the baby his? Every eye turned to her. Josephine met Elias's gaze and saw what he was really asking. Is there any legal argument we can make? Biologically, yes, Grace is Thomas's daughter. She took a shaky breath. But he never wanted children. He told me if I ever got pregnant, he'd beat it out of me. When I realized I was carrying Grace, I knew I had to leave or he'd kill us both. Did he ever hit you? Elias asked. Many times. Anyone witness it? His house staff. But they won't testify against him. He pays them too well and threatens them too effectively. What about proof? Scars? Medical records?
Josephine laughed bitterly. I have plenty of scars, but Thomas was careful. He'd wait until the bruises healed before letting me leave the house. Made sure I saw his personal doctor who always diagnosed me with feminine hysteria and prescribed rest. She shifted Grace to her other shoulder. There's no proof that would hold up in court.
It's my word against his, and he's rich and respected. I'm just a runaway wife. Cole slammed his fist against the wall. That's not right. That's not... Right doesn't matter, Elias interrupted. What matters is what we can prove and what we can do. He turned to Josephine. If you go back with him, what happens? He'll take Grace away from me, send her to be raised by some distant relative or boarding school. And me, she couldn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Then you're not going back. Elias's voice was final, absolute. We'll figure something out. He has the law on his side, Josephine said. You heard Ashford. They can arrest me, arrest all of you for helping me. I won't let you risk that. Not your choice to make. It's my life, my problem. You're part of this ranch now. That makes it our problem. Elias looked at the other men. Anyone here disagrees, speak up now. Silence. Then Marcus spoke. We stand with you, Josephine. All of us. The others nodded their agreement. Josephine felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back. Thank you. But standing with me and actually stopping Thomas are two different things. He won't give up. He'll bring the sheriff, maybe federal marshals. He'll make this as ugly as he needs to until he gets what he wants. What does he want? Tommy asked. I mean, really want? If he didn't want the baby before, why is he so determined to get her now? It was a good question. Josephine had been wondering the same thing. Pride, she said finally. Thomas doesn't tolerate being crossed. I left him, took what he considers his property. He can't let that stand without losing face among his peers. So this is about his reputation? Louis shook his head in disgust. Everything with Thomas is about reputation. They spent the rest of the day trying to come up with a plan. Cole suggested running, packing up and heading farther west where Thomas's influence wouldn't reach. Marcus proposed fighting, meeting any attempt to take Josephine and Grace with armed resistance. Tommy wondered if they could bribe someone, and Luis quietly mentioned that accidents happen to men who traveled alone. Elias shut down every idea. Running just delays the problem. Fighting gets us all killed or jailed. Bribery won't work on a man with more money than us, and I won't condone murder no matter how much the bastard might deserve it. Then what? Josephine demanded. Her nerves were frayed, Grace was fussy from sensing the tension, and she was exhausted from pacing the floor. What option does that leave us? Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then, marriage. Everyone stared at him. What? Josephine said. You marry me. Today. Right now if we can manage it. He spoke quickly, like he'd been thinking about this for a while. A married woman has some legal protection. Not much, but some. And if you're my wife, Thomas can't just claim you like lost property. That won't work, Marcus said. She's already married to Whitmore, can't marry two men at once. She can if we claim the first marriage was never legal. If Whitmore forced her into it under duress, if there was coercion. There was, Josephine interrupted. My father owed Thomas money, a lot of money. Thomas offered to forgive the debt if I married him. My father agreed without asking me. She looked at Elias. I was 17. I didn't want to marry Thomas, but my father said we'd lose everything if I refused. Coercion, Elias said. That could be grounds for annulment. Maybe in a fair court, but any judge Thomas has in his pocket will rule in his favor regardless of the facts. Not if we move fast enough. If we're already married when he tries to claim you, it complicates things legally. Gives us time to find a judge who isn't corrupt. Josephine laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. You want to marry me to buy time? I want to marry you to keep you and Grace safe. Everything else is secondary. She searched his face, looking for doubt or hesitation. Found none. Just that same practical determination that had saved Grace's life. You understand what you'd be taking on? She asked. Thomas won't just give up because we get married. He'll fight harder, make your life hell, ruin your reputation, your business, everything you've built here. Let him try. Elias? I said let him try. He moved closer, his voice dropping. I've been alone my whole life.
Built this ranch from nothing with no one to care if I lived or died. You and Grace changed that. The men changed that. For the first time, I have something worth protecting. Someone worth protecting. So if Whitmore wants to come after you, he's going to have to go through me first." Josephine didn't know what to say. This man who'd offered her shelter when everyone else turned away was now offering her his name, his protection, maybe his life. "I can't ask you to do this," she said quietly. "You're not asking. I'm offering." Grace made a small sound, and Josephine looked down at her daughter's face, so tiny, so perfect, so utterly dependent on the choices adults made. If Josephine refused Elias's offer out of pride or principle, and Thomas took Grace anyway, she'd never forgive herself. "Okay," she said. "Okay, let's do it." Cole cleared his throat. "There's still the problem of finding someone to perform the ceremony. Town preacher won't do it. Halloways control him. Judge in Red Hollow, same story." "What about a traveling preacher?" Tommy suggested. "They don't care about local politics." "Nearest one's probably in Denver," Marcus said. 3 days' ride in good weather." "We don't have 3 days," Elias said. "Tomorrow morning, Ashford comes back with reinforcements." They all fell silent, trying to think of a solution that didn't exist. Then Luis spoke up. "I can do it." Everyone turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" Elias asked. "Before I came north, I studied for the priesthood. Never got ordained, but I know the ceremony. I know the words." He looked uncomfortable with the attention. "I still have my breviary. It's not official, but if we sign a marriage certificate and file it with the territorial office before Whitmore can challenge it, would it hold up legally?" Josephine asked. "I don't know, but it's better than nothing." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. Luis went to the bunkhouse and returned with an old leather book, its pages yellowed and fragile. He opened it carefully, finding the section on marriage rights. "We'll need witnesses," he said. 2 at minimum." "You've got 4, Cole said, gesturing to himself, Marcus, and Tommy. Josephine looked down at her dress, the same worn thing she'd been wearing for weeks, stained with milk and spit up. "I should probably change." "No time," Elias said, "and it doesn't matter what you're wearing." He was right. This wasn't a real wedding, not in the traditional sense. It was a legal maneuver, a shield against Thomas's claims. Romance had nothing to do with it. But as they gathered in the main room with Grace sleeping in a basket nearby and the fire casting long shadows across the walls, it felt strangely solemn anyway. Luis stood in front of them, the breviary open in his hands. "Ready?" Josephine nodded. Elias did the same. Luis began to read, his voice quiet but steady. The words were in Latin first, then English. Ancient promises spoken over countless couples over countless years, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, till death do you part. When it came time for the vows, Elias spoke clearly. "I, Elias Vance, take you, Josephine Carter, to be my lawfully wedded wife." Josephine's voice shook slightly, but she got through it. "I, Josephine Carter, take you, Elias Vance, to be my lawfully wedded husband." They had no rings. Nothing to exchange except promises made under duress for purely practical reasons. "Do you have anything to symbolize this union?" Luis asked. Elias thought for a moment, then pulled a small knife from his belt. He turned it over in his hands, then offered it to Josephine handle first. "This was my father's. Only thing I have from him. You should have it." Josephine took the knife, surprised by the weight of it. The handle was worn smooth from years of use, and initials were carved into the wooden grip, EV. She had nothing to give him in return, nothing except... She shifted Grace's blanket aside and unpinned the small silver brooch she'd worn since her mother died. It wasn't worth much, but it was the only piece of jewelry she owned that had sentimental value. "My mother gave this to me when I was 12, said it would bring me luck." She pinned it to Elias's vest, her hands shaking slightly. "You should have it." Luis closed the breviary. "By the power that I probably don't have but am going to invoke anyway, I now pronounce you husband and wife." It was done. Josephine Carter was now Josephine Vance, at least on paper. Cole produced a marriage certificate he'd apparently had hidden somewhere, blank, waiting to be filled in.
They all signed it as witnesses, and Luis carefully wrote out the details in his neat handwriting. "I'll ride to the territorial office first thing tomorrow," Cole said. "Get this filed before Whitmore even knows what happened." "He'll challenge it," Marcus said. "Claim it's not legal. Let him try to prove it. By the time any judge hears the case, this will be on record. That's got to count for something." It was past midnight when they finally finished. The men headed back to the bunkhouse, leaving Elias and Josephine alone in the house for the first time as husband and wife. The silence was awkward, heavy with things unsaid. "I'll sleep down here," Elias said finally. "You keep your room." "You don't have to. I mean, this is your house." "Our house now, legally speaking." He pulled a blanket from the chest by the fireplace. "But let's not pretend this is a real marriage. You need protection, and I'm providing it. That's all." Josephine wanted to argue, to tell him it was more than that, or could be, given time, but she was too tired and too overwhelmed to push. "Thank you," she said instead, "for everything." He nodded, already settling onto the long bench by the fire. Josephine carried Grace upstairs, fed her one last time, and put her in the small cradle Tommy had built. As she lay in bed, she thought about the strange path that had brought her here. 6 months ago, she'd been trapped in a gilded cage, married to a monster, certain she'd die before she turned 25. Now she was in a rough ranch house in the middle of nowhere, married to a scarred stranger who'd saved her life, with a newborn daughter sleeping peacefully beside her. It wasn't what she'd imagined for her life, but it was hers, and she'd fight to keep it. Dawn came too early. Josephine woke to the sound of horses and raised voices outside. She grabbed Grace from the cradle and ran to the window. A dozen men on horseback filled the yard. At the front rode a man she'd hoped to never see again, Thomas Whitmore, as handsome and polished as ever, sitting his horse like he owned the world. Behind him were Sheriff Halloway and several deputies, all armed. Josephine's heart sank. He'd brought the law with him. Downstairs, she heard Elias open the door, heard Thomas's voice, smooth and cultured and utterly cold. "I've come for my wife and child. You can hand them over peacefully, or we can do this the hard way." "Your wife is dead," Elias said flatly. "The woman upstairs is my wife, and that baby is under my protection." A long pause. Then Thomas laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Is that so? Well then, this should be interesting." Josephine clutched Grace tighter and prepared for the fight of her life. Josephine forced herself to take the stairs slowly. Grace held against her chest. She could hear Thomas's voice floating up through the open door, that measured, controlled tone he used when he was at his most dangerous. "You've made a serious miscalculation, Mr. Vance. That woman is legally my wife. The child is legally mine. Whatever arrangement you've concocted in the past 24 hours is meaningless." "Filed and registered with the territorial office as of this morning," Elias said. "Which makes it legal as anything you've got." Josephine reached the bottom of the stairs. Through the doorway, she could see Thomas sitting perfectly straight on his horse, his expensive coat unmarred by the journey. He looked exactly as she remembered. Handsome features, carefully groomed beard, eyes that could shift from charming to cruel in a heartbeat. Those eyes found her now, and she saw the flash of rage he kept hidden beneath the cultured exterior. "Josephine." He said her name like a curse. "There you are." She stepped out onto the porch, keeping Elias between her and Thomas. "You need to leave." "I don't think so." Thomas dismounted with practiced ease, handing his reins to one of the deputies. "Sheriff Halloway has been kind enough to accompany me. Show him the papers, would you?" The sheriff, looking deeply uncomfortable, pulled out several official-looking documents. "I got court orders here. One for the return of Josephine Whitmore to her lawful husband, another granting custody of the minor child to Thomas Whitmore." He glanced at Elias. "I'm sorry, Vance, I don't like this any more than you do, but the law's the law." "The law says a woman can't be married to two men," Elias countered. "Josephine Whitmore doesn't exist anymore. There's only Josephine Vance." Thomas smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Josephine's skin crawl. "A marriage performed by an unordained ranch hand in the middle of the night? Really, Josephine, you can't expect that to hold up." "Luis was studying for the priesthood," she said, hating how defensive she sounded. "He has the authority." "He has nothing, no license, no official capacity, no legal standing whatsoever."
Thomas took a step closer to the porch. This entire charade is invalid, and once a judge reviews the facts, you'll be coming home where you belong. I'd rather die. The words came out flat and cold, and Thomas's smile finally faltered. Don't be dramatic. I'm offering you a chance to end this peacefully. Return with me now. We'll say you had a temporary bout of hysteria, and we can move past this unfortunate incident. Unfortunate incident? Josephine's voice rose despite her attempts to stay calm. You beat me unconscious 3 times in 2 years. You told me if I ever got pregnant, you'd make sure I lost the baby.
You locked me in our bedroom for days at a time with no food because I spoke out of turn at dinner parties. A murmur ran through the assembled deputies. Thomas's jaw tightened. Wild accusations from a woman who abandoned her marriage vows. Sheriff, if you please. Holloway shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Whitmore, or Mrs. Vance, or whoever you are legally, you need to come with us. We can sort out the marriage question in front of a judge, but right now I've got orders to bring you and the baby back to Red Hollow. Touch her, and you'll regret it, Elias said quietly. The sheriff's hand moved to his gun. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Am I? At Elias's words, Cole, Marcus, Tommy, and Luis emerged from the barn, all carrying rifles. They spread out across the yard, not pointing their weapons, but making their presence very clear. Thomas's face darkened. Are you seriously threatening law enforcement? Sheriff, arrest these men for obstruction. Now hold on, Holloway said, looking even more uncomfortable. Nobody needs to get arrested. Let's all just calm down and... I'm perfectly calm, Sheriff, but I'm also a man who's had his wife and child stolen from him. I expect you to do your job and retrieve my property. Property? Josephine's hands shook with rage. Is that what we are to you? Property? The law certainly seems to think so. A wife's earnings belong to her husband. Her children belong to her husband. Even her body. Thomas paused, enjoying the way Josephine flinched. Well, let's just say the law is very clear on a husband's rights. The law is also clear on a woman's right not to be beaten half to death. Doc Morrison's voice cut through the tension. He'd ridden up unnoticed, his old mare picking her way through the snow. And I've got medical records documenting every injury I treated on Josephine during her marriage. Thomas's eyes narrowed. You're a country doctor. Your word means nothing against mine. Maybe not in Kansas City, but we're not in Kansas City. Doc Morrison dismounted stiffly and pulled a thick folder from his saddlebag. I've been practicing medicine for 40 years. Treated everyone from minors to mayors. My records are accepted in every court in 3 territories. He handed the folder to Sheriff Holloway, who opened it reluctantly. His face went pale as he read. Jesus, he muttered. Broken ribs, concussion, dislocated shoulder. Accidents, Thomas interrupted smoothly. My wife was always clumsy, prone to falling down stairs. 3 times in 1 month? Doc Morrison's voice was sharp. All resulting in injuries consistent with being struck by a closed fist? Now that's just speculation. I know what a fist mark looks like, Mr. Whitmore. I've seen enough of them in my career. The doctor turned to the sheriff. Those records document systematic abuse over nearly 2 years. That's grounds for divorce in any territory. Divorce requires a court proceeding, Thomas said, which Josephine never filed for. Therefore, we're still married, and she's still bound by law to return with me. What about the baby? Tommy called out from his position by the barn. What are you going to do with her? Thomas's expression shifted to something almost disinterested. The child will be sent to boarding school when she's old enough. Until then, she'll be cared for by qualified nurses. You mean you'll take her from her mother and give her to strangers? Luis's voice was harsh with disgust. I mean, I'll ensure she's raised properly, without the influence of a mother who's proven herself unstable and unreliable. Grace chose that moment to start crying. Not the hungry cry Josephine had learned to recognize, but a distressed wail that made her heart clench. She rocked the baby automatically, whispering soothing sounds. Thomas watched with cold eyes. You see? Can't even keep a baby quiet. Hardly fit to raise a child. You son of a... Marcus started forward, but Cole grabbed his arm. Not helping, Cole muttered. The standoff continued,
neither side willing to back down. The morning sun climbed higher, but the air stayed frozen with tension. Finally, Ashford spoke up from where he'd been lurking behind Thomas. "Sheriff, you have your orders. Either execute them, or I'll be forced to report your failure to Judge Blackwell." Holloway looked from the court orders in his hand to Doc Morrison's medical records to the armed men surrounding them. He was clearly a man caught between duty and conscience. "Look," he said finally, addressing everyone, "I don't know what the right answer is here, but I do know that dragging a woman and a baby through the snow to Red Hollow in the middle of a custody dispute isn't going to solve anything." He turned to Thomas. "Why don't we table this for now? Get a proper hearing scheduled with a judge who can review all the evidence." "Absolutely not." Thomas's veneer of civility was cracking. "I've been more than patient. I followed every legal avenue. I'm not leaving without my wife and child." "Then you're going to have a problem," Elias said, "because they're not leaving this ranch." Thomas's hand went to something inside his coat. A gun, Josephine realized with a spike of fear. Several deputies immediately drew their weapons, unsure who to point them at. "Everyone just calm down," Holloway shouted. "Whitmore, keep your hands where I can see them. Vance, tell your men to lower their rifles. Not until he leaves my property." "This is ridiculous," Thomas said, but he moved his hand away from his coat. "Sheriff, are you going to enforce the law or not?" Before Holloway could answer, more riders appeared on the horizon. For a moment, Josephine thought Thomas had brought reinforcements, but as they got closer, she recognized faces from Red Hollow, the baker, the blacksmith, even Mrs. Holloway herself. They rode into the yard, maybe 15 townspeople in all, and formed a loose semicircle around the confrontation. "What's this about?" Thomas demanded. Mrs. Holloway dismounted with surprising grace for a woman her age. She walked straight up to the porch and looked at Josephine with an expression that was hard to read. "I owe you an apology," the older woman said. "When you came to my boarding house, I turned you away, judged you without knowing your story. I was wrong." Josephine was too shocked to respond. Mrs. Holloway turned to face Thomas. "My nephew is Sheriff Holloway, and I'm here to tell him that if he enforces those court orders, I'll disown him. Because what you're trying to do isn't law enforcement. It's cruelty dressed up as legality." "You have no authority here," Thomas said coldly. "Maybe not legally, but I've lived in Red Hollow for 30 years. I know everyone in this town and 3 towns over. And if you think you can just waltz in here and steal a woman and baby without consequences, you're mistaken." The blacksmith stepped forward, a massive man with arms like tree trunks. "We heard what happened, how Mrs. Vance was treated in town, how Mr. Vance took her in when everyone else turned her away. Heard about the birth during the storm, too." He looked at Josephine. "That took courage, both of you, and we're not going to stand by while some rich bastard undoes all that." More voices chimed in, each one adding their support. The baker had brought bread for the house. The seamstress had made baby clothes. Even the saloon owner, the same one who'd propositioned Josephine months ago, had ridden out to stand with her. "I was wrong too," he said gruffly. "Shouldn't have said what I said. You deserve better." Thomas looked around at the assembled townspeople, his face tight with barely controlled rage. "You're all witnesses to obstruction of justice. When this goes to court, it won't go to court." The new voice came from another rider approaching, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a judge's bearing. He rode up calmly and dismounted, surveying the scene with sharp eyes. "Judge Morrison," Doc Morrison said with obvious relief, "didn't expect to see you out here." "Your telegram was quite urgent, brother." The judge pulled a document from his coat. "After reviewing the medical evidence you sent, along with some very interesting financial records, I've made a ruling." "You have no jurisdiction," Ashford sputtered. Judge Blackwell is currently under investigation for accepting bribes. His rulings over the past 6 months are being reviewed." Judge Morrison fixed Thomas with a cold stare. "Including several that conveniently favored your business interests." Thomas's face went white. "I took the liberty of doing some research on you, Mr. Whitmore. Interesting pattern. Whenever someone crosses you, they suddenly find themselves on the wrong side of a legal dispute. And almost always, the judge ruling on the case has received a substantial donation to his campaign fund or personal accounts shortly before. That's slander. It's documented fact. And fraud. And corruption." Judge Morrison turned to Sheriff Holloway.
Those court orders are invalid. Any attempt to enforce them will result in charges against you and your deputies.
Holloway looked like he'd been pardoned from execution. He quickly folded the papers and handed them back to Ashford.
Guess that settles it.
This isn't over, Thomas said, his voice shaking with rage. I'll appeal. I'll take this to the Supreme Court if I have to. You can try, the judge said, but you should know that while I was investigating your legal manipulations, I also looked into your business dealings. Turns out you've been embezzling from your own company. Your partners are very interested in discussing that with you. For the first time, Thomas looked genuinely shaken. You have no proof. I have ledgers, signed documents, testimony from your accountant, who was very eager to cooperate once he learned he might face prison time as your accomplice. Judge Morrison pulled out another document. I'm also granting a decree of divorce on grounds of cruelty and abuse. Josephine Whitmore. He paused, corrected himself. Josephine Vance is no longer married to you. The child remains in her custody, and you, Mr. Whitmore, are hereby ordered to stay at least 100 miles away from both of them on penalty of arrest. Thomas stood frozen. His perfect composure finally shattered.
He looked from the judge to Josephine to the crowd of people surrounding him. You think you've won,
he said, his voice low and dangerous. You think this is over, but I'll destroy you, all of you. You'll leave. Now. Elias's voice was quiet but carried absolute certainty. Because if you don't, I'll let these men do what they've been wanting to do since you rode up. The ranch hands shifted their rifles meaningfully. The townspeople moved closer, forming a solid wall between Thomas and the porch. Thomas looked at Sheriff Holloway. Are you going to allow this? The sheriff shrugged. Allow what? Man's got a right to stand on his own property. You got your answer from the judge. Time to go. For a long moment, Thomas stood there, fury and humiliation warring on his face. Then he spun on his heel, mounted his horse with jerky movements, and spurred it toward the road. Ashford scrambled to follow, along with half the deputies. The other half looked at Holloway questioningly. Go on, the sheriff said. Make sure they actually leave the territory. And if Whitmore tries anything stupid, you arrest him. Don't care how much money he's got. They rode off, leaving behind an odd mixture of townspeople, ranch hands, and one very relieved judge. Josephine sank down onto the porch steps, her legs finally giving out. Grace had stopped crying and was making small cooing sounds, completely unaware that her entire future had just been decided. Mrs. Holloway sat down beside her, moving stiffly. I really am sorry for how I treated you. Why? Josephine asked. Why did you all come out here? Doc Morrison sent word about what was happening, told us about the medical records, about what you'd been through. The older woman looked embarrassed. We didn't know. We just saw a pregnant woman with no wedding ring and made assumptions. We're real good at assumptions in Red Hollow, the baker added. Not so good at seeing what's actually in front of us. The blacksmith cleared his throat. Point is, we were wrong, and we're hoping you'll let us make it right. Over the next hour, the townspeople unpacked supplies they'd brought. Food, clothing, household goods. The seamstress presented a beautiful christening gown for Grace. Mrs. Holloway offered a standing invitation to Sunday dinners. The saloon owner, looking deeply uncomfortable, handed Elias a bag of coins. What's this? Elias asked. Collection. Folks in town wanted to help with expenses. Baby's expensive, or so I'm told. Elias tried to hand it back. We don't need charity. It's not charity, it's apology money. Take it or don't, but it's yours either way. Judge Morrison had been conferring quietly with his brother. Now he approached Josephine with another document. This is a legal adoption decree. It transfers full parental rights of Grace Vance to both you and Elias Vance. Even if Whitmore somehow gets his legal troubles resolved, he has no claim on her anymore. Josephine took the paper with shaking hands. But the marriage, Luis performed it. And you said, I said Whitmore's court orders were invalid. I didn't say anything about your marriage. The judge smiled slightly. Luis Rodriguez was 3 months from ordination when he left the seminary. Close enough for territorial purposes. Your marriage is legal. Elias had been standing quietly through all of this, but now he spoke up. We should probably talk about that. Josephine's heart sank. Of course. The danger had passed. He didn't need to stay married to her anymore. "Right," she said, trying to keep her voice steady.
"We can file for annulment, or that's not what I meant."
Elias looked uncomfortable with all the attention.
"I meant we should talk about whether you want to stay married. Real married, not just legal protection married." Everyone suddenly found something fascinating to look at in other directions. Josephine stood up carefully, Grace still in her arms. "Do you want to stay married? I'm asking you first." "That's not how this works." "Seems like it's exactly how this works. You're the one who got dragged into this mess. You should get to choose." Josephine looked at this man who'd saved her life twice now. Once by offering shelter, once by offering his name. Who'd helped deliver her baby in the middle of a storm. Who'd stood between her and Thomas without hesitation. "I want to stay married," she said quietly. "If you'll have me." The relief on Elias's face was unmistakable. "I was hoping you'd say that." Tommy let out a whoop, and suddenly everyone was talking and laughing. Mrs. Halloway wiped tears from her eyes. The blacksmith clapped Elias on the back hard enough to stagger him. "This calls for celebration," the saloon owner declared. "I'm buying drinks for everyone." "It's 10 in the morning, Doc Morrison pointed out. "Your point?" The crowd started making plans for a proper wedding celebration, talking over each other in their enthusiasm. Judge Morrison promised to file all the necessary paperwork to make everything official. Mrs. Halloway insisted on hosting a reception at her boarding house. Through it all, Josephine and Elias stood together on the porch, watching the chaos unfold. Grace had fallen asleep, her tiny face peaceful. "You sure about this?" Elias asked quietly. "It's not too late to change your mind." "I'm sure. Are you?" "Haven't been sure about anything in 20 years. But this feels right." Josephine shifted Grace to one arm and took Elias's hand with the other. His hand was rough and scarred, but it was warm and steady. "We should probably learn each other's middle names at some point," she said. Elias actually smiled, a real smile that softened the harsh lines of his face. "James?" "Elias James Vance." "Josephine Rose Carter Vance. That's a lot of names. I'm a complicated person. I'm starting to figure that out." The townspeople eventually departed, promising to return in a few days for a proper celebration. The ranch hands headed back to work, giving the newlyweds some privacy. Even the judges Morrison left, though not before securing promises from everyone to testify if Whitmore tried anything else. Finally, it was just Elias and Josephine and Grace, standing on the porch of Stone Ridge Ranch as the winter sun climbed toward noon. "I should probably move my things downstairs," Josephine said, "to your room, our room. Or I could move mine upstairs. More space up there. The baby wakes up crying 3 times a night. I've slept through worse." They went inside together, and Josephine realized this was the first time since arriving at the ranch that she felt truly safe. Not just protected, but safe. Like this place was actually home. Over the following weeks, they settled into a new rhythm. Elias moved into the upstairs bedroom, and they learned to navigate sharing space, awkward at first, but growing easier as they learned each other's habits. He was a light sleeper who woke at the slightest sound, which meant he often got to Grace before Josephine even fully woke up. She discovered he liked his coffee strong enough to strip paint and couldn't cook anything more complicated than beans. The townspeople kept their promise about the celebration. A month after Thomas's departure, they threw a party at Mrs. Halloway's boarding house, a real wedding reception with food and music and dancing. Grace was passed around like a treasure, cooed over by every woman in attendance. Josephine danced with Elias for the first time, discovering he was surprisingly good at it. "Where'd you learn to dance?" she asked. "My mother taught me, before she died." "You never talk about your family." "Not much to tell. Mother died when I was 12. Father drank himself to death 2 years later. Sister died when I was 25. After that, I was alone." Josephine squeezed his hand. "You're not alone anymore." "No, I'm not." Spring came slowly to Stone Ridge Ranch. The snow melted, revealing brown grass that would eventually turn green. The cattle grew fat on new growth. Cole found a wild horse he wanted to break. Marcus started courting the seamstress from town. Tommy and Luis built a new shed with surprising competence. And Grace grew. She started smiling at 6 weeks, which made all the sleepless nights worthwhile. Started reaching for things at 2 months. By 3 months, she was giggling at Elias's scarred face, fascinated by the way the damaged skin moved when he talked. "She likes you," Josephine observed one evening as Grace grabbed at Elias's nose. "She's got terrible taste," Elias said, but he was smiling. "Same could be said for me. I married you after all." "You married me to avoid being dragged back to Kansas City. I stayed married to you because I wanted to." Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and Josephine saw something in his expression shift. He leaned over and kissed her, gentle and uncertain, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed. Josephine kissed him back, less gentle, more certain. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Grace made an indignant sound at being temporarily ignored. "Sorry," Elias told the baby. "Your mother's distracting." "Your father's not so bad himself," Josephine said, testing out the word. Father. It felt right. Life wasn't perfect. There were hard days when the work was overwhelming and money was tight. Days when Grace cried for hours and nothing helped. Days when Josephine woke from nightmares about Thomas finding them and Elias had to hold her until the shaking stopped. But there were good days too. Days when the whole ranch gathered for dinner and the house filled with laughter. Days when Grace did something new and everyone celebrated like it was a miracle. Days when Josephine and Elias worked side by side in comfortable silence, no longer needing words to communicate. Word came 6 months after the confrontation that Thomas Whitmore had been arrested for embezzlement and fraud. His trial was set for fall. Judge Morrison sent a letter saying Josephine might be called to testify, but probably wouldn't need to. The evidence was overwhelming. "How do you feel about that?" Elias asked when she read him the letter. "Relieved, vindicated, a little sad maybe." "Sad?" "I wasted 2 years of my life on him. 2 years I'll never get back." Elias pulled her close. Grace nestled between them. "But those 2 years led you here. To us. To this life. So maybe they weren't completely wasted." Josephine thought about that. About the path that had brought her from Kansas City to Red Hollow to Stone Ridge Ranch. Every terrible thing that had happened, every moment of despair and fear had led to this. Standing in a kitchen with a husband who loved her and a daughter who was healthy and happy. "No," she agreed. "Not wasted, just the long way around." Grace chose that moment to spit up on both of them, which kind of ruined the romantic moment, but also made them both laugh. "Bath time," Elias said, already moving toward the basin. "For all of us, I think." As Josephine helped clean up their daughter, she thought about how far she'd come. From the terrified woman sitting on a trunk in Red Hollow to this, a wife, a mother, part of a family she'd chosen rather than one chosen for her. The future was still uncertain. The ranch might fail, money might run out, Thomas might get out of prison someday and cause more trouble. Life had a way of throwing problems at you whether you were ready or not. But Josephine had learned something important. She was stronger than she'd ever imagined, strong enough to leave an abusive marriage, strong enough to give birth in a blizzard, strong enough to stand up to men with power and money and the law on their side. And she wasn't alone anymore. She had Elias, solid and steady beside her. She had the ranch hands who'd become brothers. She had a town that had learned to see past assumptions. She had a daughter who would grow up knowing she was wanted and loved. That night, after Grace was asleep and the house was quiet, Josephine and Elias sat on the porch watching the stars come out. The air was warm for the first time in months, carrying the scent of grass and horses and possibility. "You ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't offered you that job?" Elias asked. "Every day. I'd probably be dead. Grace definitely would be. You'd have found another way. You're too stubborn to just give up." Josephine leaned against his shoulder. "Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky darken from blue to purple to black. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Closer in, the horses nickered in their stalls. "I love you," Josephine said quietly. It was the first time either of them had said it. Elias's arm tightened around her. "I love you too, both of you." It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was no magical transformation, no sudden perfection. They still had problems to solve and challenges to face. Elias was still scarred and gruff. Josephine still woke from nightmares sometimes. Grace still cried at 3 in the morning, but they had each other.
And for the first time in her life, Josephine understood what it meant to be truly home. Not a place you were born into or forced to stay in, but a place you chose. A place you built with your own hands and your own heart. Stone Ridge Ranch wasn't much to look at.
The house needed repairs. The barn leaked. The land was harsh and unforgiving. But it was theirs. Every difficult, imperfect inch of it. And that was enough.